Right. Yes. Welcome everybody here today on Ash Wednesday, and of course we'd like to start these proceedings by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the lands and waterways in which we are here today. So I'd like to pay my respects to the elders of Camaragal country, which we are on today, and acknowledge them, the past and present and future elders, on the continued custodianship and guidance on the lands we are on today. So today we have a mid-candidature review of Chris Duncan, and he will go through his topic shortly. Firstly, I'd like to introduce his panel, which is made up of Professor Rhonda Craven as his principal supervisor, and co-supervisors are Dr. Kim Ralston, Dr. Melita Jones, Dr. Georgia DeMush, and also the associate supervisor, Professor Manley Begay Jr., and also associate supervisor end user, Mr. Laurie Perry from OneOak. And on today's MCR panel, we have the two experts, Professor John Marshall Reeve, Professor Jesse Gow, who are led by the most capable Professor Herb Marsh as chair. And without further ado, the floor is yours, Chris.
Thank you, Ricky. Warming Ngai, everyone. A warm hello. How are you in Darug language? Thank you very much for coming along to my mid-candidature review. My thesis topic is Indigenous Secondary Pre-Service Teachers' Perspectives of Enablers and Barriers to University Progression and Completion as a Cross-Cultural Analysis. So essentially what this thesis is aiming to do is to fill a gap in the literature which exists because there is little research or specific support structures to enable Indigenous student success at university. We know that university is an absolute game changer for Indigenous students. We may only make 1% of the entire student population, but we know that a university education is an absolute game changer for communities, for families, and for Indigenous peoples all over the world. The aim is to identify the enablers and barriers and to identify policy strategies to better support the next generation of students. The thesis structure is listed on the slide. There are essentially 10 chapters and there are 3 studies that are a part of this particular project. Underpinning this research are 4 key theoretical perspectives, or 4 key theories that are a mixture of Indigenous and Western theories. So firstly, looking at Indigenous standpoint theory, particularly drawing on the work of Smith and Nakata, we are looking at the privileging of Indigenous perspectives and worldviews, which runs right throughout the project. We see then the Indigenous social and emotional wellbeing model, which acknowledges the interconnected nature of wellbeing for Indigenous peoples, which is different to Western conceptualizations of wellbeing, for instance, linking elements such as being able to connect to country, as well as cultural wellbeing. We then have 2 more Western ideas, looking firstly at self-determination theory and looking at the key psychological needs of students in secondary education who are Indigenous. So looking at autonomy, whether they feel like they can control their own journeys, looking at competence, whether they feel like they're doing a good job in the journey that they're undertaking, and relatedness, whether or not they feel like they are actually achieving what they've set out to do. We then look at towards a positive psychology of Indigenous thriving by our own wonderful Professor Craven and her team, which establishes that this project is using a strengths-based approach and using the ENU model, ENU standing for exemplar, measurement and utilisation, where we're looking for examples of Indigenous success in different parts of the world. We're looking to measure the success that they are having and then looking to apply this and replicate the success that's being had in different Indigenous contexts. Cumulatively, these theories have assisted in underpinning the research questions, which I'll go through shortly, as well as the interview questions for students and academics, the data analysis for each study, and will ultimately result in the development of a new model of support for Indigenous secondary and pre-service teachers. Off the back of that, there are 5 underpinning theories right across this project that have been employed, both Indigenous and Western in nature. The first, and perhaps in my view the most crucial one, they're all important of course, but the most crucial is looking at yarning methodology. That is reflecting Indigenous voices, worldviews, and perhaps quite importantly, traditions. That's our law and law as Indigenous peoples. and that particularly draws on Basarabin and Gandu's landmark article from 2010, and a number of other people started publishing in this area since. The systematic review and meta-analysis, particularly pertinent for study 1, which I'll go through in a minute, providing a succinct answer and strong understanding of the topic area that we are dealing with. The use of semi-structured interviews, which looks at using broad, open-ended questions to allow each of the participants to yarn through what it is they need to yarn through in order to answer the questions. Particularly looking with a view towards data analysis, then we're looking at narrative inquiry, particularly applied to the interviews conducted, and studying the stories and experiences that have been collected throughout this project. And finally, decolonising methodology, which looks at really unpicking and undoing the ways of colonisers, that is Western methods of research, which ultimately over the last couple of centuries, we have seen that Indigenous views have largely been ignored. Cumulatively, they have enabled the establishment of key relationships and the maintenance of those relationships right throughout the project. They've also allowed for participants to yarn in depth about their own experiences without being cut off by either myself or anybody else. They've also privileged Indigenous worldviews and our own ways of knowing, being and doing as Indigenous peoples. And finally, they've allowed for culturally appropriate inductive data analysis. In understanding and I guess justifying why 4 nations were picked to be part of this research, we can see a number of similarities. The 4 countries that were picked were Australia, New Zealand, Aotearoa, the United States and Canada. And the key similarities that run right across each of the nations in this study are listed under the purple heading there. And essentially we see really strong connections between Indigenous peoples in each nation and country, or land as conceptualised in each part and each country in the world. Traditional education systems are then rooted firmly in oral and experiential pedagogies, that is learning by experience and learning through storytelling. We see that each country in some way, shape or form has been invaded by a foreign colonial power, the common thread being the English, though noting there were French and Spanish elements in North America. Subsequent to that, there was the imposition of Western ideologies, religions, education systems right across all 4 nations involved in this study. And finally, this resulted in the rather clear disruption of Indigenous educational methods and their subsequent replacement with Western methods. There are a few differences in each of the countries. For instance, Australia is the outlier in that we do not have a treaty between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in this country. The other 3 nations in this study have at least one, or in the case of North America, a whole slew. New Zealand, Aotearoa, has a treaty of Waitangi, and there's some 305 treaties in North America. Māori culture is then a significant part of society. One only needs to look at any of the main airports you land in as a baseline example, where everything is in English and te reo Māori as one base example. There were also very successful and crucially recorded movements of resistance in North America. We also note the New Zealand wars in Aotearoa, but essentially when we're looking at Pontiac's War, this is probably the keystone and I guess most important piece of resistance movement that has occurred. And finally, there are varying levels of success in embedding Indigenous content in school or tertiary curriculum, and that varies wildly across all 4 countries, and even more so in the United States, where it really depends on the individual state or institution that we're looking at. So, study 1 essentially was a systematic review of the enablers and barriers to university secondary teacher education, progression and completion. What we're really looking at is trying to get a good sense of what literature already exists in this area, and basically underpinning and using the methodologies and theories was quite important, and is quite important as this study is ongoing. So looking at the key methods used in study 1, we see that systematic review and meta-analysis is of course a key part of that, in identifying the research questions, inclusion and exclusion criteria, the searching of databases, screening and data extraction, as well as synthesizing results. The use of yarning was also extremely important and is still extremely important in that process, because we need to be able to have those conversations in a culturally appropriate context, regardless of whether that's been between me and other academics, myself and librarians, myself and any other person that's relevant to the study. Decolonising methodology also was used here to preference and privilege the work and the voices of Indigenous peoples. Right throughout this project, we're seeing, I guess, a new generation of academic come through, where there are some more Indigenous academics than, you know, past decades and centuries, which is fantastic to see. But those voices did need to be privileged, and decolonising methodology absolutely assisted with that. In terms of the key theories, Indigenous standpoint theory much achieved the same thing in the privileging of Indigenous people's voices, ways of thinking, knowing and doing. And self-determination theory was also important to analyse levels of satisfaction, as well as cases where there's been the thwarting of basic psychological needs, especially, of course, autonomy, competence and relatedness. So in terms of the progress that's been made in this individual study at this particular point on this particular day, the research questions have, of course, been identified. The inclusion and exclusion criteria has been formulated. It has been checked some 5 or 6 times. That is by myself, by 2 members of our wonderful IPPE professional staff, as well as 2 additional rounds of feedback from the supervisory team, and a final check by one of the librarians who was involved throughout the process. So that gives me a total of 6 rounds of feedback on those criteria. The databases are listed on the screen as well. So the key databases searched were ERIC, Scopus, ProQuest Education and Informant, and we have approximately 13,100 results that have been uploaded to Covidence, and as soon as Rhonda gets a new group of interns, I will very keenly grab them and use them to help out in the screening process. Study 2 and 3 I'm going to cover in terms of the same time, because they are quite closely linked together in terms of the application of the theory and the methods and the progress in those in both of those studies. So study 2 looks at the cross-cultural enablers of and barriers to university secondary teacher education, progression and completion. And so this really employs, you know, the strengths-based approach here. What is working, why is it working, and how can we replicate success elsewhere? Study 3 then looks at Indigenous identified strategies to enable university secondary teacher education progression and completion, and address the barriers to progression and completion. Now, this is where the barriers come in. We are, of course, acknowledging the fact that students do face both successes and challenges right throughout their degree. And that may manifest at any number of points right throughout their course. But study 3 in particular looks at, well, how do we move forward? How do we pick the successes that are occurring in each of the 4 nations that are part of this research? And how do we ensure that essentially Indigenous peoples get a better deal worldwide? What can we learn from overseas? What lessons can we bring back? And as a result of this, how can we make the next generation that's going to come through our doors have a better experience than those that have gone before them? So the key methods that were used across both studies 2 and 3, I'm going to note very quickly the participants for each or both study 2 and 3. A total of 11 participants from each of the 6 universities involved in this study will essentially be interviewed across the process. As we can see at the bottom, some of this has already been done, some of it is yet to be completed. There are 6 universities involved in this study. Of course, Australian Catholic University as the home university, Charles Darwin University up in Darwin on Larrakia land, the University of Adelaide on Corner Country in South Australia, as well as our 3 overseas universities, the University of Auckland in New Zealand, Aotearoa, Northern Arizona University at Flagstaff in Arizona, the United States, and First Nations University, which is mainly in Regina, kind of in Saskatchewan in the middle of Canada. And so the breakdown of the 11 participants is 1 senior executive staff member who is Indigenous, 2 coalface academics who are teaching into the secondary education degree, and then 8 students who are within reasonable reach of the final year of their particular degree in secondary ed. So in the key methods section here, we are looking at firstly yarning methodology, and this has been really crucial in underpinning everything to do with study 2 and 3. It underpinned the development of questions. It underpins the feedback, some of the feedback that was given on the questions as they were developed, and likely would have also impacted, I guess, our ACU IREC processes. That's our Indigenous Research Ethics Committee. It also underpins the interviews conducted right throughout in being able to allow the participants to yarn. And Basarabin and Gandu established 4 types of yarning, and essentially this falls directly and squarely under research topic yarning. It also will impact the data analysis for studies 2 and 3, as it is important that we establish, a key relationship. We're planning on having 2 other Indigenous academics to assist with the data analysis for studies 2 and 3 to ensure intercoder reliability. And essentially what we're really focusing on here is making sure that those relationships are safe, stable, clear, and everybody's clear on what we're actually looking for. Semi-structured interviews were also used and are being used across studies 2 and 3 with each participant, regardless of whether they're an academic or a student. And that allows for participants to develop contextual answers to reflect on their own experience and their lived experience as relevant. It also allowed for the practicing of Dadiri, which is a Yolngu form of deep listening, to ensure that the participants had the right to fulfil the answer to the question as they saw fit and without interruption, which is really key in this project. We then use decolonising methodology, again allowing for Indigenous voices, because ultimately we do walk in 2 worlds, that being Indigenous and Western, and to be able to reflect accordingly on those experiences which often interact with one another. Narrative inquiry is then going to be used in the data analysis stage and again in conjunction with yarning. So the key theories then used in studies 2 and 3, of course, Indigenous standpoint theory, allowing space for Indigenous voices to be heard, validated, affirmed, and then subsequently recorded in academic literature. Looking at self-determination theory, participants have been able to reflect on their own senses of autonomy, competence, and relatedness as driven through the interview questions that have been established. Thirdly, the social and emotional wellbeing model for studies 2 and 3 guided the creation of the interview questions for both academics and for students, and allowed participants to reflect accordingly in line with elements such as the EMU model. Finally, towards a positive psychology of Indigenous thriving, drove the strengths-based approach, that the first couple of questions that were asked of participants were in the strengths realm before then delving into the barriers, so that hopefully what they remember is that they got to talk about how awesome they were. As we can see in the table, I hope that's coming out clearly online, some of the interviews have already been conducted, and we're nearly complete with ACU. I've got a final couple of interviews that had to be moved due to extenuating circumstances that will be completed by the 13th of May. At Charles Darwin University, we did interview a larger number of academics. That was due to a range of reasons, which I'm happy to go through in questions or later if people would like me to. The University of Adelaide is booked in for the week starting the 17th of March for data collection there. University of Auckland, data collection was completed at the end of November. Northern Arizona University, we have actually, I think no less than about an hour ago, locked in mid-April to conduct our data collection over there. And First Nations University, we are trying to finalise a date with them in the very, very near future. So what we can see in the overall, I guess, big picture kind of progress since confirmation is that candidature was, of course, confirmed, upgrade to a PhD also confirmed in 2023. I think perhaps the big thing at the moment, though, is that this project was funded by an ACES large grant to the tune of nearly $150,000, which has allowed quite substantial support in being able to, number one, reimburse the participants that have been interviewed, and secondly, has allowed me to actually go to each university that's part of the study and continues to allow me to do that. We then see that beyond this, we are looking to wrap up data collection. Per this slide, we really would love for this to be done by the end of June. That would be the absolute latest, end of second quarter. We want this done. Ultimately, we are on a pretty fair timeline, I think, for a timely completion. Candidate does not run out until 2028, and we would be targeting submissions somewhere in the second quarter of 2027. So what the remainder of this year looks like is finalising the interviews and data collection as a priority. Secondly, then really delving into study one, particularly looking at the covenants review and data analysis throughout that particular study, and then looking at the data analysis across studies 2 and 3 as well, and then preparing an initial draft chapter result. Looking at next year, we would want to finalise the data collection, get the draft chapters complete in light of feedback from the supervisory team, of course. And then on top of that, I do have an invitation to write a book chapter on some of the strategies that we come up with. That will, of course, go through the year in consultation with the editors. And then, of course, continuing to review feedback. And then finally, mop up, making sure that the entire thesis is ready to go in 2027, that there are a few rounds of feedback on the entire thesis, and then pray the good Lord above, be able to submit and hopefully get a really good result. So finally, as many references as I could possibly fit on one slide. And before I jump to questions, just a public thank you to my supervisory team who have been absolutely stunning and incredibly supportive throughout the project. And thank you as well to the panelists in advance for your feedback. So with that, I am happy to move to questions.
First of all,
very professional presentation. Filled in a lot of the questions that I had from the, in terms of the chapters that you presented. I didn't have a sense of where they fit into the big picture. You've done a wonderful job of providing the overview of that. Could you give a little more focus on the systematic review? I mean, the systematic review was study 1, but it seems to be study 3. In terms of the timeline, and what's the connection between the systematic review and the interview, and what is it you're looking for? A little bit of the, maybe something inclusion, exclusion, how you planning on doing that? Just a little more detail on that.
Yeah, sure thing, and thank you for the question. Firstly, to foreground, I had every intention of doing study 1 first, and then in June last year, ACES come walking by with $150,000 for me to do data collection and to really push this one forward. So unfortunately, we had to kind of switch the order because I wasn't going to let 150K kind of walk by. That, that's a massive amount of money, which I'm very thankful I've got. But so I guess, so that's a bit of grounding in terms of why that's kind of gone last. So that's, I think, first part of the question. Second part of the question in terms of what we're actually looking for. So we've basically split the search terms into 4 separate columns. And basically we've drilled that up in consultation with a couple of the IPPE professional staff and of course supervisory team. So first column was looking at Indigenous people, so Indigenous groups. Because what we've realised is that there have been lots of changing terminologies over time, and that isn't necessarily reflected in research more broadly. One example is that even in legislation here in Australia, it's the Aborigines Protection Act of, I think, 1909 off the top of my head, whereas the word Aborigines is no longer appropriate. And so that's taken some time for the research to kind of, I guess, catch up. And so we had a whole list, I think it was nearly some 300 Indigenous groups all around the world. And the purpose of that is to capture anything else that isn't covered in the study. We do recognise that there are only 4 countries involved in the study. As much as 150,000 is an amazing amount of money, that still doesn't allow me to do, I guess a John Hattie style kind of, I'm going to look at every single possible, Indigenous peoples throughout the world. And so the systematic review really allows us to capture what else is being written, especially for a lot of mobs in, and when I say mobs, that is kind of an Indigenous word for kind of group of people or nation. A lot of mobs, say, around Africa and Southeast Asia that have very different histories compared to the nations involved in the study, to see, well, what are they doing? What kind of supports are in place there? What does, extant international literature kind of say? And so in connecting that to study 2 and 3, what we're really trying to do is give a more full international picture that we can get, yes, the data, the lived experiences and the stories from 4 nations that have reasonably similar histories, yes, changed by a couple of centuries between Australia and Aotearoa compared to North America. But then that's also complemented by what else is actually going on, parts of Africa, South America, Central America, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, as kind of the main kind of areas. Even Samoa, right at the top of Scandinavia, would be another one. So I hope that answers the question.
Good, thank you.
John Marshall?
Okay, thanks. Let me start with asking what the aim or the potential contribution of the research is. And I found this on page 33. Identify the factors that enable Indigenous students to successfully complete secondary teacher education degrees.
Okay, so firstly, the contribution, number 1, is that the theories are being applied to a new context. It's the specificity of targeting secondary education students who are Indigenous. And I hope no one's going to correct me, but I don't think anyone's strictly developed that before. Secondly is a new model of support. In recognising, yes, theories, and theories obviously have been a very significant assistance in being able to develop that. And basically what we're trying to do is basically go, well, here's the successes that we're having in the 4 countries involved in the study and also informed by the systematic review. If you actually do this, you might get more Indigenous students through the door. You might have more Indigenous students graduate and subsequently more mob in the classroom, which is a massive, massive problem in a number of jurisdictions. Yes, included in this study, but also more globally. So in terms of identifying the enablers will really allow us to get a sense of what's working, why has it worked, how are we going to actually be able to replicate some of that success.
Okay, my question is, I think all 3 studies have the same aim, identify these enablers and barriers, and then eventually you want to build a model. Okay, then you're done. But then, to me, that's part 1. Part 2 is testing the model, see if you're right. Because once I use all these interviews and meta-analysis, I develop my model. And I say, this explains it. And then you test it. And you have a very good deep into measure. Did you, graduation, yes or no? So I think part 2 is missing. Are you going to be satisfied with, once you develop your model, you're done? Do you need to test it or validate it? I know that's a quantitative kind of approach, but still, I want to know your model's more than opinion. Has something that I would call predictive power, or I don't know what the qualitative researchers would call it, that it's valid, predictive, whatever the right word is, that it's more than looking backwards. I can take the next student who comes to me and give them good advice about enablers and barriers.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is definitely part 2. I think within the scope of the PhD, it is definitely the model, and this would be a fantastic postdoc to be able to test this and apply it. And when the time comes, I'd love to have a conversation with you about it if you're open to it. So, yeah.
Okay.
Jesse?
Well done, well presentation, Chris. The written chapter about the CR.
You just
Hear you, Jesse.
Could you hear me?
Try again, Jesse.
Could you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, well done. Well presentation, Chris. The written documents about like the theory or methodology is very comprehensive. However, this is a mid-candidate review, so we would like to see some findings from your studies, from your PhD study. And I saw you still working on your study 1, this review, and Do you have any like preliminary finding from your study 2 or 3 you would like to share? Because I saw you've done some interview already.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you very much for the question. Of course, that the results chapters weren't part of this submission. I'm thinking they're probably going to be the final year review. But in terms of some preliminary findings, I'm going to split it into enablers, barriers, and ideas on moving forward. So firstly, looking at the enablers, culturally appropriate support from day dot is something that the participants have reflected on quite strongly. That is meeting key stakeholders even before orientation for some of them, where some universities had, you know, a kind of a meet and greet, come in for a cup of tea and a barbecue. Of course, I'm going to use the cup of tea example, but basically bring them in, get them to meet their lecturers in charge. Thank you. Get them to meet their lecturers in charge, get them to meet the key support staff. So in Australia, that's the Indigenous higher ed units, as well as perhaps, you know, placement teams was another one identified. That's also meeting the course coordinator. So culturally appropriate support from the start is really crucial. Another thing that's been identified is financial support. And this was in reflection of a few participants who identified that either they were able to provide financial support or they had received financial support, and this allowed them to undertake a range of opportunities that they otherwise wouldn't have had access to, that just flat out could not afford it. So, for instance, some universities offered a particular program to go and study a unit overseas, and some of the participants reflected on the fact that the university supported them financially to do that. What we also saw was social support was really key as well. So establishing, you know, who are the other first years in the cohort, who else is starting, and then connecting those first years to, you know, your third and fourth year students, using the Australian context as an example. So establishing those key relationships with students who had already been through what they had, what they were going through in their first year, and knowing that they weren't alone, they were going to be supported. And all it was going to take was, you know, a phone call, an email, catching somebody after class, you know, on the way to the bus, to just put their mind at ease that things, you know, could actually be dealt with. And then when needed, to go to a key academic who had a really deep understanding of the, you know, policies and procedures, even when we're looking at things like appeals. In terms of the barriers, number one, finance. That's come through very, very loud and clear. You know, financial barriers, you know, and noting the interviews done here in Australia and Aotearoa, that was an issue that came up. Cost of living came up multiple times. Cost of rent, being able to buy textbooks. And yes, some units still require a purchase textbook. I know a lot in this place have moved online, but that's not quite the case everywhere. And being able to fund placement. And a few of them did mention placement poverty, that essentially they're going somewhere between 3 weeks for perhaps first couple of placements, right through till final placement, which in secondary can be a full school term, so 10 weeks, 2.5 months, is massively draining. They're, you know, trying to plan and save to fund their final prac, because then instead of having perhaps 3 or 4 days to work with, including a weekend, they're culled to a 2 on top of a half teaching load as well. So finance has been a really big message. In some places as well, lack of cultural support was another one. And this came down to, I guess, participant experiences at a unit level as well, where they had a particularly unsavoury experience, shall I say, without spilling too many of the beans. And then, especially in their first year, not necessarily knowing where to go. The students who had kind of the meet and greet, or really, you know, got to meet some of their, I guess, more experienced students, were able to navigate this a little better. But then some of the students were really focusing on, well, I had this rotten experience with this particular person in year 1, semester 1, and I was about to drop out. And that was some of the thing that was coming through from some of the participants. We also look at lack of support for placement and external experiences. So some students reflected on the fact that they wanted to do a placement in a different town, city, state, even in a couple of cases, and there were varying levels of success as to whether or not those opportunities were supported. Some students also missed out on other opportunities to, head, say, overseas on a unit as one example, and then that naturally impacted their experience of that unit because they were feeling like they weren't supported by the university. In terms of ways forward, that is something that is still coming out through the research that we are completing. But at this early point, noting that I haven't done interviews in the US or Canada, and they are two of the contexts out of the four. A model that definitely looks at cultural support is really important. Some students were also walking in not necessarily knowing much about their culture or having very intergenerationally explained reasons why they haven't necessarily engaged with much culture until hitting university. Secondly, we'd be looking at financial support as well, especially with a key focus on placement, because that has come through absolutely loud and clear. And then thirdly, the social support. That's probably in a nutshell what we've got at this particular point. But Jessie, thank you for your question. And I know more things are going to come out as I finish the interviews and then can develop it in full.
Yeah, interesting finding. I'm looking forward to your full result of the study too. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessie.
Thanks, Jesse. All right, open up the floor to questions here on both online.
Deb.
Right. One of my key interests is in the methodology, and what you have outlined here with the yarning methodology emerging from and then enriching narrative inquiry is truly transformative, and it is going to become a much greater and stronger methodology for working not only with First Nations communities, but with other disenfranchised and marginalised communities where the individual voices have not yet been fully heard and fully responded to. Are you looking at how ACU itself can actually advance that methodology?
I think I would love to at some point. And I guess the old saying goes, what's good for mob is also good for non-mob as well. And that's something that I know I personally embed into my teaching practices, regardless whether it's AFB or mainstream. So firstly, thank you for your question. I totally agree that I think it will be transformational and it will have that kind of wider reaching impact. But certainly as a postdoc, I think looking internally about how we can advance that for a wide variety of groups. We're looking, say, at our Clementi program as one example, that really is effective at, supporting marginalised peoples to get into a university course and to get a qualification. And, particularly perhaps even with our diploma students in mainstream, that could be another angle as well. I saw pretty recently, I think there's another program running out of Parkleigh Prison, I think, from memory. That was on Workplace the other day. So that could be another angle on top of that. So I think we're coming up with a nice little track of research to do after. Yeah. Thanks, Deb.
Thank you.
Thanks for your presentation. My question is very simple. So why are you specifically interested in secondary pre-service teachers?
Yep. Okay. Thanks for your question. It's not something I really got a chance to kind of cover in this presentation. So number one, I was a secondary teacher myself. I used to teach history, geography, Aboriginal studies, legal studies, English, religion, and anything else they threw at me. There's just a few there. So I have that own lived experience of having gone through the degree myself. And, I graduated, I think, in 2000 and end of 2015. I had to work that for a second. But, things have changed to an extent since then, and things have not in some ways. And that's what I'm seeing through some of the data. So I have been an insider researcher for some of this project, especially at ACU, because I am an alumni of ACU as well, noting that I have been an outsider as well in different contexts. But I guess my interest in this project really comes down to, number one, my own lived experience as an Aboriginal man, you know, who was a secondary teacher, and number two, that it's nowhere near enough of us in the room. Some of us are having amazing success in the classroom as Indigenous secondary education teachers. But when you have a school of, you know, 1,200, 1,400 students, the number seems to just go up year on end, and there's one Aboriginal teacher, and that's it, and there's 50 kids, you know, sometimes they get lumped with, you know, right, you're automatically the Aboriginal liaison, and it shouldn't be the case, because we need to be able to be what we can see, and if we can't see it, then we're not going to aspire to it. It is perhaps a little bit less of a problem in primary, still a big problem in primary, but it's a bigger issue in secondary. And I guess, yeah, drawing on my own lived experience means I want to make tomorrow better for mob coming through.
For one more question. Anybody online? Just checking. No. Oh, yes. Go, Mitch. You got the last question.
Right.
You're mute. Yep.
You hear me, Chris?
Clear.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think this is a fantastic project. I really enjoyed listening to it as a Quandamooga secondary teacher. I've just got a quick question around your theory that you've embedded for data analysis. I noticed that you had Linda Tui Smith's work cited and Knott's work. But for me, decolonial agendas in research and for data analysis purposes are really about addressing the coloniality of power. And in your case, this could be around addressing certain power imbalances in our current education system. This work primarily stems from a South American context and from academics such as Annabelle Kikano and Walter Mignolo. So have you considered using decolonial theory from where it originated from and from those international scholars alongside Smith and Martin? Yeah.
I think I got most of that. Firstly, Mitch, thank you for your comment and question. I'm certainly most happy to consider it. You know, if you think that's going to strengthen and benefit the project, then I'm more than happy to certainly consider it in line with feedback from my supervisory team, and perhaps we can have a yarn about it at some point.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I'm happy to point you in the right direction. That's stuff.
Thanks, Mitch.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, everybody there, and thank you, everybody online. Can you please give one more round of applause to Chris? Well done. Thank you, everybody. Can I please ask everybody, the panel, to stay online? Just the Georgia and Manly, if you can stay online. Everybody else, thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, Ricky. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone.
Oh.